Welcome back. From Hegel, now we're moving quite resolutely into the realm of out of the realm of pure ideas and into the realm of quite palpable historical consequences. Following the young Hegelians who came immediately after Hegel, and as part of their crew of arguers and debaters, Marx came to understand Hegel's work as offering a new philosophical vision for the shape of understanding the world and also guiding human action within it. Following especially in the work of a young Hegelian named Ludwig Feuerbach, Marx came to see, or believe he saw, that religion was nothing but alienated human longing. But that doesn't mean that Marx didn't appreciate its power. Far from it. He thought religion had been the most powerful reality in human history, precisely because it had been the consequential and structure of the way that humans thought about the problem of evil. But as history moved on, things were changing in Marx's own time, and history was changing precisely because humans were, and here Marx is an Hegelian, coming to self-conscious awareness of their own power and their own capacities to change the world and themselves. This is the motivating point behind Marx's famous claim that up till now, all the philosophers have done is interpret the world. The point, however, is to change it. This is different from Hegel's cunning of reason, which implies a kind of suprahuman force working out its own self-meaning in and through human history. This is an idea that Marx could not but see as expressing human self-alienation. Rather, for Marx, the crucial fact about history and its processes is that it is the working out of the species being of humanity, the yet unknown human nature, whose dialectical self-unfolding is driving history itself. The important difference between Hegel and Marx, then, is that for Hegel, history is fundamentally a story told about somebody else. It's about God coming to maturation and self-realization. For Marx, it is about the self-realization of humanity. In a way, this is a throwback to the Enlightenment's optimism of the will, the idea that in the end, sheer human effort is the one thing that will save us. But it's also the fact that force, the human will, is in fact powerful enough to do this salvation. And not just hypothetically powerful enough, but in fact inevitably powerful enough. More so even than Hegel, Marx thought he understood in fairly concrete specificity how human history would come to its culmination over the next century or so, and what the end of history would in fact look like. Now, Marx is often read as somehow a 20th century Russian thinker who accidentally lived in the 19th century. But in fact, he was a genuinely 19th century German thinker who spent much of his adult life, actually, in exile in London. And he himself felt the pain of the social evils his work talked about and his work struggled so fiercely and so profoundly to overcome. The details of his life are relatively simple. He was born in 1818 in Trier, in the German Rhineland states, the Palatinate states, and he dies in 1883 in London. He and his wife, Jenny, had 7 children, but only 3 lived to adulthood. 1 died at age 8, 2 died aged 1 year old, and 1 died 2 days old, before he even had a name. Experiences like that would give you a taste for the evils of early industrialized society, particularly when you think that Marx himself was known as a very loving and warm and generous person, especially to his family. It's not often we know the family histories of great philosophers. Many of them have been effectively celibate. But with Marx, at least, we have a story of someone whose very family bears the cost of his own struggles to understand what was going on in his day. Now, much of his income, actually, in his life came from two sources. One was his ally and very dear friend Friedrich Engels, who had a certain amount of money from his industrialized family, his wealthy family of industrialists, themselves working mostly in the British Midlands. Marx also was a very good and successful journalist. He wrote a number of reports about the US Civil War for UK newspapers. He never went to the US, he was in England, but he nonetheless was one of the most important journalists of the 1850s and 60s and 70s, and he made a good deal of money that way. Now, Karl Marx is not a theoretical innovator in thinking about evil. Rather, he's an exemplary figure for a certain centrally practical response. He was Hegelian in imagining that the resolution of the problem of evil is one fundamental dimension of the goal of human history, one crucial aspect of what history intends to be. But as we saw, he differs from Hegel in some very important ways. Most immediately, and pretty importantly, his, unlike Hegel's view, was a materialist understanding of the human. Now, people talk about materialism all the time nowadays. Marx means something very central by it. He means that not ideas, but material circumstances determine human thought and action. That is to say, ideas come from material conditions, from a cultural location, not the other way around. It was, after all, the printing press, Marx pointed out, that enabled the spread of Martin Luther's ideas and their fertilization of minds all across Europe. Now, this is not a flat-footed claim that no one can think beyond their material conditions or that everyone is constrained by their immediate surroundings to only be able to think thoughts that are only acceptable to those people in those surroundings. It's nothing that naive. Besides, there's no, properly speaking, beyond in any of these settings. There's no way of talking about a boundary around a culture or a particular class status or something like that. This is not meant to be, that is, a constraining doctrine, but simply a statement of how thinking is never totally free-floating from our material conditions, the facts of the way we live our lives. Without the right material conditions, Marx believed, people can't think the new thoughts that revolutionize those very material conditions themselves. A thinker like Isaac Newton needed a certain background, needed a certain culture of education, and needed a certain amount of wealth in order to acquire the education that enabled him to generate the thoughts that led to, first of all, calculus, and then to the Principia, his mathematical modeling of the physical basis of reality. And then that model of the physical basis of reality had to be transformed into a structure that other people could understand and appreciate. And then it had to be published. And there had to be people capable of understanding and reading it. And all those things are not just ideas, those are material realities. It's quite possible for people to have great thoughts, but not have ways to express them or have people who could receive them. Our thoughts are not totally unconstrained. They're shaped, formed by what we have been taught, by what we can imagine, and by what others can receive from us. Even technical geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci or Thomas Edison can only imagine what they can imagine and what they did imagine because certain conditions were in place for them to do so. And most of us can't imagine nearly as far away from our material realities as they did. More specifically, though, more precisely than this general issue about materialism, Marx is the founder, or the greatest formulator, we could say, of an approach to evil that we must directly confront. The idea that evil, both what we name evil and whatever wickednesses we do, is due to social conditions and material inequalities. Against Hegel, Marx insisted that evil is due to these inequalities, these social conditions, and therefore it is contingent, not necessary. and it would be overcome within history, not at its end. This is really important for Marx. Whereas Hegel offers a kind of metaphysical consolation to all the people in history, that eventually history will make itself clear and everything will be seen to be for the best, Marx says, that's not true. What matters, though, is that evil can be fixed now. Certain forms of evil may be necessary in the development of capital across stages, sociologically and economically. But that doesn't mean that the development of capital is itself, in some sense, intrinsically requiring evil facts as part of its justification. Now, what is evil for Marx? It's a structure of unequal social relations where some are able to gather wealth, what he'll call capital, from others' labor and to reinvest that wealth in ways that make those inequalities ever greater. And Marx doesn't think this is a new thing. He thinks this is going back thousands of years. Certainly at some point when everyone was in a tribe on land, there wasn't that much capital, there wasn't that much wealth that people had. Some people had maybe more seashells than others. Some people had different roles where people would give them corn or something so that they would perform certain rites for the people who gave them the corn. But nonetheless, people were roughly equal in terms of the amount of wealth they had. But over time, and especially once you get industrialism, enormous concentrations of wealth occur. And this wealth, when it is so concentrated, creates its own rationale for how the world should be run. Naturally, those who have it, who have the wealth, learn to enjoy its comforts, become accustomed to them, and wish to keep them, and grow to demand to keep them. They grow concerned that others don't have these comforts, and they want to keep others away. Disparities in wealth, that is, lead to, are related to, disparities in power. And far more than the causality moves in the other direction, far more, that is, than disparities in power lead to disparities in wealth. Material wealth, for Marx, is a social force and a social reality more fundamental than political power itself. Right? So for Marx, political power actually is secondary to economic wealth. Political power, in fact, is nothing more than a device for securing those who have wealth to keep wealth and ensuring that those who don't have wealth can't take it from those who do. It's not necessary that those who don't have wealth can't get it. They just can't get it from the people who have it already, right? Which is going to be kind of hard. How do they get wealth otherwise? Well, some social turbulence is possible, but realistically, Marx thought, effectively, those people who have wealth are those who are likely to get more wealth in the future. Now, these inequalities, inequalities of wealth, basic material inequalities, lead to differences in all sorts of realms of human life. Differences in education, in the cultivating of capabilities, in your developing your skills, your gifts, your calling, differences in mortality rates, differences in overall life health, differences in comfort. They lead to all the differences of quality of life and cultural mode that lead people, Marx thought, to do wicked things or not to do wicked things. Now, note here an interesting thing. We've been talking about evil, but ethics hasn't come in here at all. Marx wasn't necessarily someone who disagreed with people who thought that this practice was immoral. He did think it was pretty immoral. He did think it was pretty a shocking thing that some people had all this wealth and they wouldn't share it with other people. But he did think that talking about it as immoral was not as fully powerful a way of talking about it as simply pointing out the bare material facts. He thought that understanding those facts, understanding the underlying structures of the logic of history, what he thought was the logic of history, he thought that would be a more powerful motivator for effecting change than preaching to people in any way. Furthermore, he was never really much of a normative thinker. That is, he wasn't directly or immediately interested in telling people what they should do. A little bit like Hegel. He was interested in understanding what had happened, what was going to happen in history, not to guide the dynamics, not to ride them in any way, for he thought that the dynamics of historical change were pretty much unstoppable, but in order to slightly and subtly shape them, shift their course moderately, and best endure their process through our lives. But evil here is not simply just a consequence of material inequalities. As such a consequence, evil also is, Marx firmly believed, strictly speaking, almost all of evil is a sheer accident. Were we in a social order of total equality, where each was given all they needed to cultivate themselves, and each gave back to the whole the fruits of their self-cultivation, which is what socialism is for Marx, no such evil would be real. Now, this, by the way, this is really important. Marx's understanding of socialism, something just to pause on for a second here, it's not really socialism in the way that we've come to understand it. You can't blame Marx for what came to be understood as socialism, say, in the East Bloc of the communist nations governed by the Soviet Union for most of the second half of the 20th century, say. For Marx, socialism, or what he thought of as true communism, is about self-cultivation and expression, and about the real joys we have in how our action lies, and the delight in our action lies entirely in the cultivation and the exercise of our talents, not in the products of our talents. In our experience of socialism, right, in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union especially perhaps, workers had everything taken away from them that they made by the state. This is in an important way not socialism, this is a complete monopoly of control by the state government. Now you may think that that's a distinction without a difference, but Marx didn't. He didn't believe that true socialism would take away from people the things they cared about, but rather that the things they didn't care about would be the things the state would take away. Things that they would be instead considering not as objects to be held close to their chest as possessive, but things that they understood essentially as means of sharing. Consider the difference between someone who cooks for a living and someone who cooks for friends or for the sheer pleasure of cooking itself. When you cook for friends or pleasure, you would be scandalized if your friends left money for you. That's not the point. Marx thought that one day, money would never be the point of all of our labors. People would simply love to do the work they found themselves able to do and delight in the exercise of their talents in doing that work. The product of the work, then, would not be where people found their value or their identity. It would be merely in the exercise of their skills. You see, Marx wasn't really interested in a revolution on the social order. He was interested in a real revolution of human expectations and longings. He wanted us to get beyond the idea that what we actually are looking for in the world are more goodies, and come to see ourselves as most fundamentally creatures who find a certain joy in the exercise of a certain set of gifts and skills that we have. If we did that, Marx thought, we would no longer be as grasping as we are about material objects. Now, all of this is just an aside to his notion of evil here. Coming back to this again, he wants to say that changes in social conditions and material inequalities can alter or even do away with most evil. If we get the social system right, if we get the structures right, evil will go away. If you get society organized in the right way, the transformations of human behavior that will enable us to exercise our skills in certain ways and delight in their exercise, those individual anthropological changes, those dispositional changes in the self, those will happen if we just get the social system right. Yeah, there will be accidents of nature. There will be earthquakes, landslides, bad weather, tornadoes, maybe even a certain range of people who are insane, pathological, right? A kind of crime of nature, in a way. And perhaps even a minimal level of carelessness and common human thoughtlessness. But the really big evils of human life, Marx thinks, such as young people worked to death in factories or mines, plutocrats throwing away enough food from their feasts to feed the hungry mouths for months, mouths that slump unfed outside their doors, murder and killing within and between nations, criminality in the lower classes, alcoholism, drug abuse, sex slavery, all these would go away because their basic cause, he thought, the disparity of wealth and thus the existence of a painful gap between the haves and the have-nots, that would go away as well. Now note here, it's important to see that when Marx talks about a revolution, he's not talking about a philosophical revolution. He's thinking of a revolution in terms of the practical disappearance of the concrete evil itself, not in terms of the disappearance of the cognitive problem of evil, the intellectual problem of evil. The crucial fact, he thinks, is that real concrete suffering is what must ultimately go away. The intellectual puzzle of evil is, for Marx, only a puzzle that grips us to the extent that we at least tacitly acknowledge that we cannot ourselves come to solve the practical problem, right? This goes back to his claim about Feuerbach that philosophers have up until now interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. We can interpret evil as much as we want, Marx thought. The crucial thing is that small children stop dying, okay? Now, this means that he thinks that evil will not be an important theoretical problem for people if the concrete problems go away. That is, that the concrete problems matter more than anything else. By any means necessary. That's going to be a really crucial phrase as we go on. Because it turns out that if your main goal is the removal of these concrete evils, a vision of this sort can undergird an ethic of really quite brutal consequentialism. Once you're convinced you know the remedy for suffering and evil, you can justify a great deal in doing what you must to ensure that in fact suffering and evil do go away, or even are simply substantially reduced. As the very, very well-known and remarkably gifted German communist writer Bertolt Brecht said, "Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral." First comes food, then morality. Then we'll worry about morality, right? In other words, give people enough to eat, then talk to them about right and wrong. Morality is in some important way contingent upon decency, and to get to decency, anything is necessary. This means that, paradoxically, for Marxists, if not for Marx, but for Marxists, it may well be the case that the most ethical people ultimately are those who are least apparently ethical now, and those people who are caught up in adhering to ethics in the present, those who are caught up in believing in the proper possession of property, and how it's improper for a poor person to take something that a rich person has. For Marxists, that kind of ethics may in fact be, in the long run, in the ultimate aim of ethics, itself immoral. It may be the case that it is people who look immoral now who turn out, on a Marxist view, to be properly moral in the distance. Brecht himself, the writer Bertolt Brecht, had a great line about this in a poem called "To Those Who Are Born After." He said, "We who wish to lay the foundations of peace and friendliness, we could never be friendly ourselves." Right? A lot is packed into that phrase, "we could never be friendly ourselves." If you think about the history of, say, Marxist ideology in the 20th century, to call it unfriendly is probably an understatement. But in any event, this is how Marxism, which meant to remedy evil, became, ironically perhaps, one of the most powerful ideologies for doing evil that the world has ever known. Now, it's not entirely fair to blame Marx for all the things done by those who said they followed him, in the same way that it's, of course, not entirely fair to blame Jesus for all the things done by those who said they followed him. Nonetheless, it's an interesting fact that some of the most frankly moralistic visions of life, even if they don't admit that they are moralistic, are often the most quickly and dangerously corrupted. Now, Marx himself, in this way, raises two very large and fundamental questions for our class. One theoretical, one practical. The theoretical question goes back to the debate between Rousseau and Voltaire. Does the approach that Marx offers, an approach again that focuses ruthlessly on the practical solution to the practical problem of evil, does this solution, does it offer enough respect, does it give enough respect to theoretical questions about evil that humans might have? Doesn't the sheer phenomenon of evil itself stand in need of being accounted for? Is there no theoretical worry here that will trouble people? Is a purely materialist resolution of all these problems adequate to meet any intellectual puzzle that people will have? I actually don't think so. I think that this is a failure of Marx's not only political anthropology, but in a way his philosophical anthropology. This is my view now, so this is not Marx. I actually think that any attempt to offer an account of the problem of evil that fails to talk about why evil happened in the first place and offer an adequate account for why that is, ultimately adequate account for why that is, seems to suggest that our capacity to wonder and be puzzled is far less immediately part of who we are than I think it is. In fact, I think our capacity to wonder abstractly about things is very central to who we are. That's one problem with this view. The second problem with the theory lies in its understanding of history. And again, this is this theoretical question about whether or not you need a theoretical resolution to the problem of evil. Marx's understanding of the problem of evil means that at any moment when there is suffering in the world, we will understand ultimately that suffering to have been justified, a la it was with Hegel, only because that later event that is caused by the suffering is much better than it would have been absent the suffering. In other words, every moment in history doesn't have its own integrity. Its meaning, its ultimate significance, is only part of a larger story. We can't know the meaning of any moment until the later moment. In another way, the moment of history that we are going through at this time is never something that is fully clear to us now. And we can't actually know what it really means yet, because history as a whole is an organic unity. That's one view of history. That's Marx's view. That's Hegel's view. Each moment of history is not possessing its own integrity. It requires a certain attention to the overall scope to see what it really means. The other view, which is a different one, and I think one that is at least more plausible initially, is the idea that each moment of history is in some important way possessive of its own integrity, its own autonomy. Each moment of history, were it to be subsumed or consumed into the totality of the whole, would possess its own integrity that would resist and protest that consummation, that consumption. Each moment of history, that is, in this rival view to Marx and Hegel, has a kind of moral sense which is determinate in itself. Now, if you believe in the second account of history, so that at a moment, the evils or the goods that happen in that moment bear their own significance and their own meaning within themselves, if you believe in that view, no matter what the justification of it is down the road, somehow the suffering of that moment still stands out as demanding some kind of answer. There must be some account of why that had to happen. And if there is no account of why it had to happen, why there was a necessity to its happening, that's fine. But tell us then that there is no necessary justification for us. Tell us then that that moment of suffering has as its own meaning the real suffering of the people within it. And that in some sense, that suffering matters not just in that moment, but eternally, as the ultimate eternal meaning of that moment of suffering. In a way, I'm gesturing at the idea that there might be different meanings of God here. Remember, Hegel at least insists that God becomes identical with the world spirit working itself out. Marx obviously doesn't have a sense of God in that way, but Marx nonetheless thinks there's nothing outside of history. The picture I'm offering you is a picture where each moment is individually seen by a God outside of time, outside of history, in eternity, who sees each moment in its integrity and sees it as an integral moment. Now, that's all the theoretical debate, theoretical questions around Marx. The practical questions are more immediate and direct. Most obviously, is it viable to say that evil can be solved in the way that Marx suggests it can? The history of Marxism after Marx does not give us a great deal of confidence that Marxism became, on the whole, a device for ameliorating human suffering, to say the least. If anything, as I said before, I'd say the consequentialism it justified provoked in people a kind of amplified level of cruelty and aggravated the suffering of the human race, at least for a century or so after Marx's own death. Ironically, it may be that a materialist like Marx offers a solution accentuating the felt need for a theoretical explanation of evil. That is to say, a thoroughgoing materialism may make the need for an idealist explanation of evil almost intolerably strong, because the more rigorously the materialist explanation is worked out, the more its absence feels felt in the world that we experience them offering us. Now, interestingly, in Marx's own time, in some of the work he himself did as a journalist, as I suggested, there was, in fact, a problem of evil, a theodicy problem being practically worked out, the problem of American slavery, climaxing in the struggles around the American Civil War. In our next lecture, I want to turn to the story of that evil and how that evil was dealt with by two American thinkers who tried to give an account of what it was, where it came from, and what might happen to it that speaks well beyond the confines of that one particular historical event.